Well, welcome back to a brand new season of The Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. I'm Brittany Brander, and with my co-host, Scott Crockett, we explore both the big challenges that Albertans face, but also the big solutions that Albertans create. And we trust that all of you had a great holiday season and are ready to welcome the new year with open arms. And as has become tradition on this podcast, we're starting the season by looking at what is on the minds of Albertans as we head into the new year. And we've invited back well-known pollster Janet Brown to give us some insights on how Albertans are feeling about things like the economy, their household financial situation, and expectations around the provincial election. We'll dig into the ideas and priorities for Albertans ahead of the election, and questions and headlines that we can expect for this year. If you found this episode interesting or insightful, let us know by heading over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and give us a quick review and a rating. Now, on to the show.
Well, thanks for joining us today. Our first podcast on Alberta Better, The Brief, early in 2023. And for those of you who have been longtime listeners to this podcast, our next guest will be no stranger to you, public opinion pollster Janet Brown. And we always love to bring Janet on at this time of the year because she's just got her finger on the pulse of what Albertans are feeling and thinking, how they're approaching the year. And, at the beginning of a new year always feels like a great time to do that. So, Janet, I think you're well known to most Albertans and listeners of this podcast, but maybe my very brief intro for anyone who doesn't know you is Janet Brown is an excellent pollster with a focus here in Alberta, a public opinion guru, a regular commentator in the media and on many of the nation's top podcasts. But I know her best by her title as the Oracle of Inglewood, and which I think sort of sums all that up as the person who always just has the sense of what's happening in Alberta, particularly in an important year like this. So Janet, thank you and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So I always talk about public opinion, or I like to think about it kind of like a compass on a hike, maybe would be a good way to describe it. And, whether you're running a business or a large organization or you're in policy or politics, I think that it can kind of help you point the way for where Albertans are generally headed. And that's neither right nor wrong. That just says this is the way that Albertans are headed. And if you align yourself with that, you may find that you've got an easier path forward than if you try and work against that. First, do you agree with that, with my clumsy hike and compass analogy there?
Yeah, I absolutely do. And one of the ways we always qualify polling is to say, it's a snapshot in time, right? And it's kind of a bit of a cop-out. It's a way of saying well, that's what it was, yesterday, but we expect it to be totally different tomorrow. So polls have their limitation. They're about the days that the data was collected, but they do give you an idea. And if you do polling in a strategic kind of way, they can also give you a sense of where people are going. And Scott, you and I have known each other for a long time. And I think I said this to you 15 years ago, right? You don't have enough money to change anybody's mind. You got to figure out what people are thinking, and you've got to figure out how to gear your message towards them. So, my work with clients, it's all about helping them understand where the hearts and minds of people are. A lot of my clients want to know where their hearts and minds are from a voting perspective. Sometimes it's other things from a consumer perspective, but understand where people are at, understand where their opinions are firm, understand where they're soft, and then, gear your message accordingly. But, opinions are very slow to change. So you've got to, that's what research is all about, is figuring out where people are entrenched and figuring out, where opinion is movable.
So let's just jump right into it then. Where are Albertans' hearts and minds? As the fog from the holidays maybe clears in the first few weeks of the year, and people are sitting down with their to-do list for this year, what are the priorities of Albertans in 2023?
Well, I think the fog is still lifting for a lot of Albertans right now. That first week back, we're saying, what is it that I do for a living? What do I make for dinner when I'm not eating leftover turkey? So I think everybody's trying to find their way. But at the Christmas break, there were two key things that had people preoccupied, and I think they're just going to they're going to enter back into people's consciousness, and that's inflation and healthcare. And in the polling that I do and the polling I see other people do, those two things are the clear top two concerns. They sort of change places as top of mind or not. So healthcare, there's a lot of bugs going around. We've had stories of very long wait times in hospitals, big surgical backlogs. So that's going to continue to be a concern for people. And I think the germs that, coming out of the holidays are going to propel that concern forward. And then inflation, right? The credit card bills are going to come in for Christmas. The heating bills for that very cold snap that we had are going to come in. And I think inflation is going to continue to really dominate people's concern.
So inflation and healthcare. Now, we have the good fortune that we did a podcast very much like this at the same time last year and asked you the same questions. Give us your snapshot, Janet. How are Albertans feeling compared to how they were feeling at this time last year? Are we more optimistic, less optimistic? Where are we at?
Well, I should have re-listened to the podcast, but what I can remember is, coming out of 2021, we were still very much concerned about the pandemic. And I think we were optimistic that the end was in sight for the pandemic. And we were thinking about economic recovery. But, that was the sort of the key thing that was dominating concern then is like, what does the way forward look like after the economy? The other important thing is, and I know we don't want to get too political in this podcast, but a year ago, we were really concerned about Alberta's political future. There was a lot of discussion about whether Jason Kenney could hang on or not. And, it's funny, 2022 wasn't an election year, but,
except it sort of ended up feeling like it in a lot of ways.
On an emotional level, there were three big electoral events. Like we thought we were going to have a leadership review in April, right? So we all geared up for that. We all, got manned the barricades and got ready for some big change happened in April. Then that got postponed. Remember, that was supposed to be the in-person event in Red Deer, right? Then they just got worried about the logistics there. They postponed it till May 18th. Then we all sat on pins and needles. Jason Kenney was very clear. Hey, if I get 50%, we're moving forward. Well, he gets a little more. So we have the race. He gets a little more than 50%. And we're like, okay, he's going to stay on. And then 2 minutes later, he says, that's not enough. I'm going to leave. So there was that all emotional roller coaster on May 18th. Then we get into like the leadership review. Then it takes, was it 5 or 6 ballots to decide that, Danielle Smith was winning. So it wasn't an election year, but it had all the emotion of an election year. And now we're going into a real election year. So anyway, going back to 2022, Albertans were really uncertain about their political future. And now, well, we know who the leader of the UCP is, and we know who the leader of the NDP is, but we have all sorts of uncertainty about what our government's going to look like when we do this podcast next year.
Right. And let's book it on the calendar right now.
Yeah.
I have one more then and now question, to the extent that you have a picture on it. It's kind of that household financial situation idea. You mentioned that last year at this time, there's still a lot of sort of COVID related uncertainty, I guess, and how the economy was going to recover, but inflation had not necessarily set in to the same extent that it had now. Do you have a view on, as those holiday bills roll in, are Albertans more or less comfortable with their ability to pay them than they were last year?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, back in January, there was, inflation wasn't a concern at all. Inflation really popped up as a concern in polling in about June. Now, there's 2 questions I track on a very regular basis. We ask people their sense of how the economy's going. Is it improving, declining, or staying the same? And then we also ask people to rate their household financial situation. Now, we saw this really funny phenomenon happen during the pandemic. People's concern about the overall economy on a macro level became quite high. But when you ask them about their personal situation, people actually felt more comfortable on a personal level during the pandemic than they felt either before or after. And, at first that seemed counterintuitive, but then when you think about it, you're not paying for there's all these other stresses around the pandemic, but you're not paying for childcare. You're only buying tops. You don't have to, you're wearing track pants on the bottom. I'm making light of it because, obviously there were some households that suffered mightily through the pandemic. But as long as you had a stable job, and as long as you had a job that you could do from home, your personal financial situation actually improved. then we saw coming out of the pandemic, we saw that the numbers about personal financial situation have gone back to pre-pandemic levels. So we didn't have inflation of concern before the pandemic, but we had other concerns about jobs and the economy and the low price of oil and stuff like that. So now we've declined to pre-pandemic levels in terms of fear about our own personal household financial situation. But what's driving those fears is differently. It's not low oil prices anymore. It's inflation, it's cost of housing, it's cost of living.
So Premier Smith actually announced some inflation fighting measures last year, $600 for seniors, family-aged recipients, rebates on electricity bills, suspending fuel tax, etc. What impact do you think that those measures have had on how Albertans are feeling about their household situation? Are Albertans noticing these measures? Do they feel that they're helping?
I don't think we've been able to see any impact yet. It was mid-November when Danielle Smith announced those things, and none of the money has gone out yet, right? So no, we haven't really seen an impact. Now, January 1st, the fuel tax came off, but as that happened, gas prices, other factors were driving fuel prices up, right? So what we heard was a lot of grumbling of, where's that 13 cents I was promised, right? So I don't think the fuel tax thing has worked well in government's favor. I think there was also a lot of discussion about who was left off when those programs for receiving $600. If you don't have children, if you're not a senior, so you've got some really low income people with no children or with older children, and so there's a lot of people who are struggling economically who haven't been covered by those things. There's other programs that they should benefit by, but it's hard for them to see the direct benefit. So I think probably we have to wait and see. We have to wait for the money to roll out before we'll really know whether people feel that that's enough of a difference to make them confident about their economic situation.
So another major story from this past year was just our migration numbers were incredible. The last year we saw more Canadians moving to Alberta than leaving. Why do you think that is?
Why do I think more people are moving to Alberta?
Yeah, why do you think people are finding Alberta to be a very attractive place to live?
Well, I think it's the inflation story, and I think it's the cost of housing, right? And so we all changed our lifestyles so much during the pandemic, right? And now we're like, the three of us are in the same city, but we didn't even talk about trying to do this podcast in person. We just took for granted we would all sit in our offices and do it independently, right? So I think it's about sort of change in lifestyle and the affordability and the opportunities here in Alberta. And again, I know we don't want to get too political, but there's a lot of talk about political uncertainty and how that's undermining the economy. But there's just some real bread and butter things that make Alberta a very attractive thing. And so, I have friends in Toronto. I think about the apartment that I used to have when I lived in Toronto over 20 years ago. And I didn't have a place where I could have had a home office and that sort of thing. So you got a married couple in a 1-bedroom apartment in Toronto, and they're talking to their friends in Calgary who have 3 bedrooms and a den, and have a mortgage that's still 30% lower than their friends in Toronto, that becomes very appealing quickly. And as more and more people can work wherever they want to work, well, why wouldn't you want to work in a place where you can have a home office and you can, get to the mountains in an hour?
Well, and I can't help butting in for 1 second on that one too, because I think, I just have this personal feeling that I think people way overemphasize political uncertainty when they think about people's decisions on where they're going to move. I mean, all the evidence that I've seen generally points to the kinds of things that you were talking about, which is economic opportunity, affordability issues, things like that. Who the political leaders are at one level or another, I think is generally way down the list. And I think we tend to overemphasize that a bit.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I also do think that people think about, can I get the kind of house I want? Can I have the kind of lifestyle I want? Will I find friends in Alberta? Will I find like-minded people? So political uncertainty, no. But I do think that, and we did this when we worked together on the Define the Decade project, is I do think culture is something that matters to people. And I do think Alberta has to think about what it's sending out into the rest of what we're sending out in terms of our brand, for sure.
Do you think that the Alberta is Calling campaign has had any sort of impact on these numbers and on people's decisions to move to the province?
Well, there was a big jump in, the big jump in numbers, but I have to say that that's probably more correlation than causation. The idea that campaign like that could have such an immediate effect. I mean, most people have to give notice when they, when they leave a job or leave an apartment or something like that, or sell a house. So, I think that if a campaign like that was going to work, I mean, Scott and I in previous jobs, we worked on enough ad campaigns. It had the potential to have an impact, but I don't think it's had a potential to have an impact that quickly.
Yeah, my gut is it's helped. And I think correlation versus causation probably makes sense. I can say, with a relative certainty that it certainly generated conversation. And that's probably one of the first goals of any kind of campaign like that is, hey, have you seen those ads about moving to Alberta? Or I heard somebody who did. So I'm pretty positive towards the campaign, but then again, our council has said, hey, we think this campaign's a good idea. We'd like to see more of it.
So looking a little bit beyond Alberta, to what extent do you think that events happening across Canada and then also international events such as the war in Ukraine impact the stories that we're seeing in headlines and public opinion in the province? Do you think that as Albertans, we're looking a little bit more outward to the world or a little bit more inward at ourselves?
I think Albertans, I think all Canadians are guilty of this. I think we're pretty insular. I think we focus pretty close to home on issues. And, we know what's going on in the world. It's Ukrainian Christmas this weekend. I know lots of Albertans are reaching out to their Ukrainian friends to make this difficult time easier for them. Like, we're not oblivious to what's going on in the world. But at the same time, I think we're pretty insular in our focus. And one of the things I'm thinking about is I asked some questions, I think it was in the fall, about inflation. When inflation first popped up as an issue, I asked people, the extent to which they thought inflation was impacting their life. And I asked some questions about what they thought the causes of inflation were, right? And I think the number one cause, if I remember correctly, was people said, well, it's the policies of the federal government. It's the policies of the Bank of Canada. People were really buying into those Pierre Poilievre talking points that he had during the leadership campaign. And I think it presented a list of 6 things to people. And, Trudeau was the number one cause. I think the Bank of Canada was the number 3 cause. So it was Trudeau, supply chain was number 2, Bank of Canada was number 3, the war in Ukraine was number 4. And I laughed at that. And I thought, oh, more people think Justin Trudeau is responsible for global inflation and think Vladimir Putin is responsible for that. So I wasn't shocked that people understood supply chain was an issue, but I was shocked that people didn't seem to see a big connection between the war in Ukraine and inflation. I mean, it's certainly not the only cause. I'm not an economist, but I mean, it's not the only cause of inflation, but it's certainly one of the things that's driving up oil prices, for instance.
So as we look to 2023, there's just no way to look at this year without talking about the reality that there's going to be a provincial election, most likely at the end of May 28th, I believe, according to our
29th, I think.
29th, okay, 29th. According to our election date legislation. Thank you for that. And now, you've been very good about saying on this podcast, we try not to be political. We aren't. We like to think about the ideas and the policies. So I'm not so interested necessarily in the horse race numbers and things like that, but I am interested in the ideas and the thoughts that'll be on people's minds. So I guess my first question for you, Janet, is, you've seen a lot of elections. Do you think this is going to be an election where there's room for ideas and policy, or is this going to be all attacks and zingers and sound bites?
Well, so I was thinking about, how do we talk about an election without being overly political? And so let me start by saying that at this point, anything can happen. My own view of things is that, Danielle Smith has gotten off to a rough start as premier, but she seems to be getting her feet under her. Maybe the NDP has a bit of an edge right now, but there's nothing that they can take for granted. So, I brag all the time about the fact that, I did the only poll in the 2019 election that was within the margin of error. So like, I'm, 2 weeks out from the election, I correctly predicted it. I did a poll in 2018 that was within the margin of error of the 2019 election. I mean, like, we were just all taking bets on how big the margin of victory was going to be going into that 2019 election. Now we're taking bets on who's going to win. And so that makes it really different. So with such a competitive election, it's hard not to be political, but at the same time, maybe we can be less political because, the moral of the story is neither party can take anything for granted. Issues are going to matter and public engagement's going to matter. And so we don't even have to talk about winners or losers. We don't know who the winners or losers are going to be. The other thing that's kind of dawned on me in the last couple of weeks is as I look at my numbers and I compare them to what other pollsters are saying and that sort of thing, it is not inconceivable that, because pollsters, we're always trying to guess the popular vote. But popular vote doesn't win you an election.
Right.
And it is not inconceivable that the party that wins the popular vote may not form government, depending on how they're voting.
Before?
No.
Right.
No, not even close. So us pollsters, we're going to stake our reputation on total popular vote. But this next government is going to be determined by who wins the most seats, right? So we're not having an election on May 29th. We're having 87 elections on May 29th.
Riding by riding, street by street.
Yeah. Right.
So,
exactly.
and on May 29th, or the few days beforehand for the early voters, what do you think what are the questions going to be? What are the priorities going to be? I know we'll never know for sure what an election is going to be about until 2 weeks before the election or 3 weeks before the election. But what's your gut telling you?
Well, as I said, I think the things that people most care about right now are healthcare and inflation. And I am a firm believer. I do this in presentations all the time. I say, here's what people cared about in 2015, and look who won the election. Here's what people cared about in 2019, and look who won the election. Well, I think the party who wins the election is the party that's going to best speak to those two top concerns of healthcare and inflation, assuming those are still the top concerns in May. But the other sort of key variable, and I don't mean to be political by saying this, but I think the other sort of key variable is about, do you want a party that agitates, or do you want a party that is more diplomatic? Do you want a party who's committed to fixing problems, or do you want a party who's committed to sort of stirring things up? And I don't even say that in a very political sense. What I mean by that is, I asked this question in 2019 before that election. I said, what's more important to you, having a party that is going to take on the federal government and fight for Alberta, or having a party that's going to take a more diplomatic approach? And that question was, of everything I asked, the best predictor of how people were going to vote. People who wanted a government that was going to fight for Alberta voted UCP, and people who wanted a government that was going to be more diplomatic voted for the NDP. So that's, I think, the decision that Albertans have to make is, do we want to be doing things like passing a sovereignty act, talking about a provincial police force, talking about a provincial pension plan? Do we want to be talking about things that put us in opposition with the federal government, or do we want to work with them? And that was a more clear-cut thing in 2019 than it is in 2023. I think Albertans are really grappling at, whether they want a bigger fight or whether they want a better deal.
So obviously one of the themes in this discussion that we've had is inflation and healthcare. And to circle back to the beginning, we started by saying, hey, public opinion is like a compass or a roadmap. Do you think for leaders, not even just those in policy or politics, but like business leaders, organization leaders, are those lenses that they should be really looking at their plans for this year through? Should we be running everything through the lens of inflation and affordability? Yeah, if you're running a big company.
Yeah, and also I'd say, even if you're running a big company, and social services as well, right? And we talked about why people move to Alberta or don't move to Alberta. If you've got kids, you're thinking about, do I want to put kids in the Alberta school system? If your kids live in Alberta and you're like, hey, I want to go be closer to the grandkids, will I get adequate health care as a senior if I move closer to the grandkids? So although, corporations may feel that social services are removed from them, I think they also do have to think about, inflation, but they just have to also think about, quality of life in Alberta. And I'm going to go back to the Define the Decade project. And one of the reasons that I was so keen on that project was, when you and Brittany and Adam first called me, you were like, we want to understand what prosperity means beyond economic prosperity, right? So I think if you're running a company and you're worried about your reputation and you're worried about the province you operate in, you're concerned about economic stuff, but you're also concerned about the social side of the equation too.
Great point. And you know what? I'll probably remember for the rest of my life what I think it was sort of like the key headline finding of that work from Define the Decade was that for all the talk about what divides us as Albertans, we're actually remarkably aligned on what we want for our future, regardless of where we live or where we sit on the spectrum, you know, this place of opportunity, this place of belonging, place of solutions. You know, I think there's real opportunity there for anybody who can kind of align with those.
And you mentioned immigration earlier, right? And you know, there's a bad stereotype that Alberta is not a welcoming place, but the data would prove differently, that we're very open to getting immigration right. We're not anti-immigration. We think getting immigration is right, and the diversity of our population is what Albertans think is one of its strengths.
That's one of my personal missions for this year, actually, is to try and change that narrative a little bit, because Alberta is actually such a welcoming place for migration and immigration and new Canadians and new Albertans. And actually, you know, as you just said, the numbers bear that out all over the place. Not only do we have some of the most diverse cities, you know, in the country, but even the success numbers for new Canadians or new Albertans are very, very high and very strong compared to elsewhere. I did want to ask you one more sort of election related question, because you alluded to it earlier. I feel like the last 12 months or so have been very unique in that we've had these electoral like events, except that only a very small percentage of actual Albertans have generally voted in those. But generally speaking, all Albertans have paid attention to those because they've had implications on who the premier is going to be. So we had about 40 years of relatively boring politics in Alberta. Do you think that we're now in a period of volatility for the foreseeable future, or not?
Oh, it's so hard to answer that question. So we're definitely in the short term, we're in a period of volatility. And so what's happened in, you know, the last 8 years in Alberta is so I'm going to get all political sciencey here. So, you know, essentially Alberta was this sort of one party state, right? And when we wanted change in Alberta, we agitated to get the party to change. Now we've moved into this position where we have two strong parties. We have two parties that legitimately have the opportunity to form governments in Alberta. And we haven't been there in a long time. We haven't been there in most people's lifetimes. So absolutely, I think, you know, as long as both of like the fundraising numbers came out the other day, fundraising numbers are almost identical. Polling numbers are very close. And you know, think about these two parties, you know, Danielle Smith, Rachel Notley, two women, two very strong women, very different women, but very sort of commanding. I did a political panel last night with Kelly Kreiderman from the Globe and Mail and Jen Gerson, you know, from the Hub. And I'm sorry, I can't remember which one of the two of them said this, but they said, you know, we're actually in this period where arguably we have these two leaders who have stronger brands than their own parties right now, right? So as long as we're in this position with these two very strong leaders with strong brands and strong parties and strong ability to raise money and all of those things, the volatility will continue. And I don't see that volatility changing until either one of these two women, you know, knocks out and says, I've had enough and leaves politics.
Right.
So, Janet, as we wrap up this episode, any final thoughts, any word of wisdom or insight that you want to leave our listeners with?
Well, I guess the one thing we haven't really talked about is just the electoral map. And I said earlier that, you know, we're not having an election, we're having 87 elections. And again, not to get overly political, but the way I look at this election, it's like, you know, Edmonton, I don't like making too many bets, but NDP is just going to sweep Edmonton. The UCP is going to do just fine outside of the cities. They're going to have very strong numbers outside of the cities. So the question is, how's Calgary going to go? And how are some of the smaller cities like Lethbridge and Red Deer going to go? And, you know, you look at the electoral map and you realize that, you know, this election is really going to be about a handful of seats in Calgary. So, you know, that's, you know, if you live in Calgary, Glenmore, Elbow, or Pagan or Acadia,
your door's going to be busy.
You are going to have so many people on your doorstep. You are going to have so many lawn signs in your neighborhood. You're going to get so many robocalls from so many campaigns. So that's one of the things that's going to be so interesting about this campaign is it's really going to come down to a small number of seats. It's going to feel like kind of like one of those US election nights where we are all waiting to find out about what happens in Ohio.
Right.
It's going to be a super competitive election. And if you like politics, if politics is your Super Bowl, man, this is going to be your year.
Well, in addition to doing this next year at this time, maybe we should pencil it in for right after the election. We can say, okay, now what?
Now what? Exactly.
As a result of it. Thanks so much, Janet. We always love having you on.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta, and you can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com. And we'd love to connect with you on social media, so give us a follow at BizCouncilAB on Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok, and YouTube. And finally, don't forget to subscribe and rate the show and give us a quick review. Your support helps us to keep making more of these episodes. Alberta Better is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. New episodes drop every other Tuesday. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.